everybody on Facebook. In 2 minutes, we will start our webinar of today about Hezbollah's deployment in Syria. I'm very happy that all of us chose to be with us today. It's a very interesting topic and a very unique report. The full report that we're going to discuss today, you can find on our website. It was written, by the way, by Tal Be'eri, who is the director of the research department of Alma. I will start with the introduction of Alma in a minute. I just want to get us all started together. I think it's important for me to say a few words about Alma Center as well, because I'm sure that not all of you are familiar with what we are doing or what we were doing just before the Corona crisis. Okay, this is, it's now 4:30 in Israel, 12:30 noon in the United States in the East Coast. I'm Sarit Zehavi, the founder and director of Alma Center. Thank you for joining us today. Just a few words about Alma Center. We are an independent institution, a nonprofit institution, and we are focusing solely on Israel's security challenges on the northern border. We believe, all of us, by the way, live on the northern border, and we believe that this issue is not reported in the right way, and actually is not reported enough in the foreign media outside of Israel, and that's why we wanted to establish an institution that will provide firsthand everything that is going on over here. You're all invited to enter our website, israel-alma.org, and to see what we do. In regular days, by the way, when people could travel, our main educational programs were dealing with tours around Israel's northern borders, just along the fence. But today, we are doing the same things actually on webinars. On today's webinars, we are going to talk about Hezbollah military deployment in Syria. And I'm very proud that we have with us today Seth Frantzman. Seth Frantzman has a PhD, an extensive director of the Middle East Center for Reporting and Analysis and Middle East Affairs, a correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. I'm familiar with Seth for a few years now, and I'm very happy to have you today. As our colleague said, is the author of After ISIS, America, Israel, and the Struggle for the Middle East. A very interesting book, very recommended. He has reported from and conducted research in Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, Israel, the Palestinian territories, and the UAE. So if you're looking for reporters at the zone, this is Seth. Seth is a former lecturer at Al-Quds University on US foreign policy. He has a PhD from Hebrew University of Jerusalem and is a contributor to Defense News, The Hill, and other publications. Frantzman was born in Maine and received his BA from the University of Arizona. Seth, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So 2 years ago, the Syrian army managed to renew the control in the Israeli-Syrian border after a few years when mainly the rebels took over the control in this border, rebels and ISIS, by the way. This success of getting back the control in these areas of Syria is part of a larger campaign while the Syrian government managed to take over other areas in Syria, and actually the rebels lost in the civil war in Syria. But it looks like the Syrian government or the Syrian regime is not the only one who is on control in Syria, is not the main one who is having the victory upon Syria. Actually, Syria became a very divided country, a country which is divided to areas of influence. And today we're going to focus on the area which is next to the border between Israel and Syria, an area that the Russians made us Israelis many promises that they are going to push the Iranians away from our borders, 40 kilometers, 80 kilometers, 120 kilometers. Eventually, we're going to talk about Hezbollah units that were deployed in this area. A special report that was written by Tal Be'eri, the head of the research department in Alma. And I hope that we will be able to, spread some light about what's going on in this area of the border. We would appreciate if you will like our Facebook page and recommend to your friends. You're of course invited to send us questions while we're speaking in the bottom of the Q&A just below the screen. And in the end, we will try to answer your questions. As I already mentioned, and I want to show you, by the way, a few maps while I'm speaking. So I want to begin with this map, which is the map of Syria, the way it is divided today. And you can see the areas of influence in Syria in pink. This is the area that is under the control of the Syrian government and what we say, the Syrian government and its allies. The area in light blue is the area that is under the control of actually Americans. By the way, blocking the way from the Iranians' shortest route from Tehran all the way to Damascus. The orange area is the area under the control of the Kurds. The blue area is an area, can you still see the screen sharing, Seth?
No, you should move the map, I think.
Okay,
it went away. There it is, it's back.
Okay.
I can see it now. I guess that means other people can see it.
So the area in orange is the area which is under the control of the Kurds, and the area in blue is the area which is actually kind of a buffer zone that was founded by the Turks and the Russians. The green area is the only area that is still under the control of what we call the rebels, but actually the most important group that takes the control in these areas is al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, actually affiliated branches in Syria and cooperating also with Turkish forces here. But we want to focus today on the area which is near the Israeli-Syrian border, which is this area, between Daraa to Damascus and from over there to the Israeli-Syrian border over here. And as you can see, there are a lot of yellow squares here, presence of Iranians and Iranian affiliated forces over here. If we try, in these days, we try to talk about 20 years to the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon. Back then in 2000, 20 years for the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, Hezbollah published its vision and said very clearly that it wants to promote the establishment of terrorist infrastructures in the front between Israel and Syria. The main goal was to enable Hezbollah to open another front with Israel in addition to the Lebanese front. It wanted to create one front all the way from the seashore to the southern part of the Golan, and actually this is what Hezbollah is doing now. In the Golan Heights, in the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, there are actually two districts of Syria. The one is Daraa, which is basically somewhere over here, and the other one is Quneitra over here, which controls most of the border between Israel and Syria. And in these areas, as I said, were dominated by the rebels during the civil war from 2011 to 2018. In these times, this was the opportunity to Hezbollah to enter to these areas under the cover, under the excuse of fighting the rebels, but actually not only fighting the rebels, but also developing its terrorist infrastructure against Israel over there. When the rebels lost 2 years ago in July 2018, this was the trigger for massive deployment of Hezbollah in this area and founding a massive military infrastructure and terrorist infrastructure in the border, across the border with Israel. Hezbollah built 2 units in this area. One is named the Southern Command Unit, which its goal is to establish a military infrastructure of Hezbollah that will be prepared to war in the future when we'll get the order. The second unit is what we call the Golan Portfolio, and we will talk about it in depth in a minute. This unit is busy mainly in planning and carrying out terrorist attacks against Israel. So let's begin with the Southern Command Unit, which is a unit, as we call it, sectorial unit. You know, they have sectorial units all across South Lebanon as well, in Syria and elsewhere as well. And this is a sectorial unit which is responsible to the area that I've shown you in the map. It is completely independent when we speak about intelligence, artillery, logistics, and it is prepared to war, given the order from Iran, of course. It has another mission, by the way, not only fighting Israel, but also rebuilding the Syrian army, educating the commanders, training the commanders, very professional training. It's funny to say this, until a few years, Hezbollah was a small militia, you know, again, 20 years to the withdrawal from Lebanon. But today, Hezbollah is the one who is training the Syrian army. In the first corps of the Syrian army that is deployed next to the border with Israel, every officer has a Hezbollah officer that is actually accompanying him and training him. Those, by the way, Hezbollah combatants and commanders are Lebanese members of Hezbollah, and they are assimilated into the corps of the Syrian army next to the border with Israel. Of course, its main contribution to the Syrian army was defeating the rebels in those areas in the summer of 2018. In this respect, the Southern Command Unit was the game changer in fighting the rebels, enabling the Syrian army fighting successfully the rebels and defeating them. Of course, the Russians also gave assistance, but this is for another webinar. We will deal with the Russian involvement in Syria. After the rebels lost in July 2018, the Southern Command Unit focused almost completely in this operatives plan of Hezbollah under the command of his nickname is Haj Hashem, but actually his full name is Munir Ali Naim Shaiti. Again, a Lebanese senior commander. I want to show you his photo. In a minute, I'll show you his photo. And you can see in the photo, Haj Hashem walking, his face they are circled in red, walking here next to the head of the first corps of the Syrian army on the Syrian Golan Heights, a man on his 50s, a very popular, experienced, professional terrorist that was involved in terrorist attacks against Israel during the years. And this person, Haj Hashem, is dressed in this photo in the same uniforms of the Syrian officers. Of course, an excellent way to conceal his activity in South Lebanon, in South Syria, in Southern Syria. This unit, the Southern Command, is deployed all over the Syrian Golan from the borderline and in depth into Syria, a few tens of miles on this line of Dara, Damascus. And eventually it is also deployed inside the bases and the military compound of the Syrian army, we are not familiar with any independent deployment of this unit. By the way, this is a little bit different from what is happening with the Hezbollah military deployment in South Lebanon. I want to say one word about that. And in order to do so, I want to show you another map, which is the map, what we call the sectarial map, the map of the northern border, because in this map you can actually see. Can you see the map, Seth?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
In this map, you can actually see that in the Syrian side, all these communities are painted in green, meaning that most of the communities here are Sunnis. While in Lebanon, in South Lebanon, most of the communities are painted in yellow, which are actually Shiites. That's why in South Lebanon, Hezbollah is deployed inside the communities, inside the civilian infrastructure of South Lebanon, while in South Syria, Hezbollah has no other option but to be deployed in the military bases of the Syrian army, because the population is a little bit more hostile than the population in South Lebanon. It's not that supportive, and it's much more difficult for Hezbollah to deploy inside the towns of Southern Syria. In any case, we understand that there are a few tens of combatants in this unit. And from what we tried, to map how they are deployed in this area, we have counted about 27 sites of the Southern Command Unit, all of them in this area of a few tens of kilometers around the Israeli-Syrian border. In each of these commands of the Syrian army, there is a presence of Hezbollah Southern Command Unit. They are working together in joint operations bases. Part of them, there is also a presence of the Iranians themselves, of Quds Force. We have also seen some observations of this, again, Syrian army and Hezbollah, and 14 joint operation rooms where you have this kind of cooperation between the two. And a few listening devices, listening compounds, what we call in intelligence SIGINT compounds aimed at Israel. I want to show you one photo of them, of one of these observation points, and which positioned in a place that everyone who visits the Golan Heights and go to Mount Bental see this beautiful view over here. And this is Tel Hara, a well-known place of SIGINT, Syrian SIGINT towards Israel. And today it's a joint operation room and SIGINT compound of the Iranians, the Hezbollah, and the Syrian army. They all coexist on this nice hill. And this photo was taken by me from Mount Bental, less than a mile from the border with Syria that goes just along the green fields over here. In addition to all of that, we have also seen 2 compounds of air defense radar, again in this area. If I want to move to Golan Portfolio, again, the mission of this unit is to create a terrorist infrastructure against Israel, not only to build its capabilities to war, but mainly to be capable of carrying out terrorist attacks. As we speak, by the way, already tried to carry out few terrorist attacks against Israel that IDF managed to prevent. This unit has the capability of gathering intelligence by itself as well in order to carry out these terrorist attacks. But in opposed to the Southern Command Unit, this unit is based on what we call the locals, the people that are the residents of the Syrian Golan, Syrians, not Lebanese. Many of them are Druze or Sunnis. They know the area very well. They can assimilate in the area very easily. Nobody will know that they are actually Hezbollah combatants. Most of them are members of the pro-regime militias or retired army, Syrian army personnel, and some of them were even rebels that, in the Middle East, it's show me the money. And rebels that were left with nothing after they lost, and they understood that the only option was to be recruited by Hezbollah, and they are getting a small salary of monthly salary of between $200 to $500, which is quite a lot in Syrian terms. These combatants of the Golan Portfolio are experts in building mines, artillery of Cornet missiles, anti-tank missiles, and other rockets, Grads, and they also have capable of night vision components, which is quite an advantage for them. We also understand that these Golan Portfolio combatants are getting the cooperation of the security services of the Syrian, meaning that both units, by the way, of Hezbollah are hosted by the Syrians. The combatants of the Golan Portfolio are having free movement in south part of Syria. They are also provided with vehicles either by Hezbollah itself or by the Syrian army, and that way they can cross the barriers in this area. This area is full of barriers trying to monitor who is going where. I must say that there is another mission to this portfolio unit other than creating terror attacks against Israel, which is also deterring and creating, I don't know, presence of another security service in southern part of Syria against the ex-rebels, against the ex-fighters that were fighting against the government in this area. And as I've said, eventually also recruiting them to their side. They are also securing Lebanese Hezbollah commanders that are visiting this area when they're coming to the Syrian Golan. And of course, goes without saying, Hezbollah is very busy with drug smuggling, and this area is strategically important with this respect because this is an area that Hezbollah can actually smuggle the drugs from northern part of the border between Lebanon and Syria, areas where they actually grow marijuana and grass, and then transfer it further to Jordan and from there to the Gulf countries and sometimes even to Israel. Let's take a look at the commander. The commander is this guy, Ali Musa Dakduk. His nickname in Hezbollah is Abu Hussein Sajed. He is, again, wide military expert. He's not a young man, as you can see, wide military expert in Lebanon, in Iraq. He was involved in attacks against the American soldiers in Iraq. He's wanted by the American security services. And after two other commanders of the Golan Portfolio, the previous ones, Samir Kuntar and Jihad Mounia, were killed, he was the one who was nominated, but he's not there. You will hardly find him in this area of Southern Syria. He's not in the terrain, he's hiding, and he understands that if he will not hide, it may endanger his life, as happened to the previous commanders. Israeli authorities itself already exposed about 6 towns where there is a presence of these combatants of the Golan Portfolio of Hezbollah. But actually, all in all, there are about 30 compounds all over the Syrian Golan. Some of them are very small, others are bigger, and they are deployed very close to the villages or inside the villages of southern Syria, next to the Israeli border. And as I've said, here these are locals, so it's easier for them to operate from inside the villages. We don't know exactly how many combatants are there, but we can assess that there are a few tens, maybe above 100, maybe above 100 operatives, which were trained either by Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon, and maybe also trained in Iran itself. During the years, these members of this unit, Golan Portfolio, as I've said, try to carry out many attacks. And those of you who met me on the border, each time I could give you an example of the previous incident that just happened a month ago or 2 months ago, but of artillery, of mines that were set next to the border. Luckily, in the Israeli side, we didn't have any casualties on the Golan. I want to talk about the last incident, or by the way, chain of these incidents that we had in the end of February this year, at the beginning of March, because it's a good example. It's a good example to explain how this unit operates. And in February 27, just a day before the Corona crisis, a few days that when in Israel everything was closed, there was an attack against a person named Said al-Tawil from a Druze village in the northern part of the Golan. Said al-Tawil was probably a commander in the Golan Portfolio, and he was killed. He was hit by a missile that was probably launched from a drone, and he was apparently the commander that is responsible in this area in the northern part of the Syria and the Golan, and was responsible for few terrorist cells in this area. Imad al-Tawil was planning a terrorist attack against Israel. He was the commander of a few observations next to the border with Israel, observation posts that just a day later were bombed probably by the Israelis. And a few days later, there was an attack by an Israeli IDF helicopter against a vehicle that was driving at the same area, a vehicle that was on its way to carry out an attack by snipers towards Israel, probably as a retaliation to the assassination against Imad al-Tawil. So from this chain of events, we can understand that Israel has good intelligence. Israel can prevent this kind of terrorist attack. But on the other hand, the Golan Portfolio is trying to carry out attacks against Israel, and Israel managed to prevent that. One last thing I want to say, which is funny, because we have been talking about two units, the Golan Portfolio, the Southern Command Unit, but actually, for me personally, the most problematic event on the northern border in the past year was last August, when IDF killed two Hezbollah operatives that were carrying drones, explosive drones, on their way to Israel to launch the drones. And Hezbollah retaliated to this attack on the Lebanese border with anti-tank missiles that were launched to the Israeli-Lebanese border. By the way, one of them hit it in a road that I drive on my way to the Golan almost every day. But this, incident, these two operatives were not part of any of these units. These two operatives that were planning to launch explosive drones to Israel were part of the Iranian Quds Force. They were annexed from the Lebanese Hezbollah to the Iranian Quds Force, meaning that actually we have three players here, at least three players, maybe there are more, that can carry out attacks against Israel. The first is the Southern Command Unit, which, as I've said, is mainly preparing to war and preparing the Syrian army to war. The second one is the Golan Portfolio, and the third one is the Quds Force themselves that are using Lebanese, always using others, to attack Israel. So that's basically, the main points in our reports. Seth, I would appreciate if you, Seth, as an expert to Syria, as a person who visited Syria, something that I myself can't do, if you will be able to give us your comments to this report, and of course, if you will be able to say a few words about the Iranian influence and the Iranian involvement in Syria, give us, a more general framing of the interests behind establishing these units in the area.
Sure. Yeah. No. Well, thank you for having me, and I really appreciated this, the way in which you've kind of mapped out for us. I think the real extent to which Hezbollah has sort of, burrowed in and used every opportunity since the year 2000 to not only take over parts of southern Lebanon, but also to insert itself in the Syrian conflict, and then to, as you noted, it's not like, it's funny how things work, right? Hezbollah used to be kind of like the smaller junior partner of Iran and Syrian regime when the Syrian regime was occupying Lebanon, and now it's like the tail wags the dog. Hezbollah is controlling not only most of Lebanon basically, or has a stranglehold. Hezbollah played such a key role in the Syrian conflict that it's training the Syrian regime. It's like not only that Hezbollah captured one state, it also has a second state in Syria. And then not only that, but, and I think that was the point of you bringing me into the conversation, is that this organization, as part of this kind of Iranian swath of control, this Iranian, what they call the corridor or road to the sea, or Shia Crescent, the way in which Iran's influence flows across Iraq into Syria and then down over the mountains into Lebanon as a kind of highway of influence. So it's fascinating, the way in which Hezbollah benefits from that, obviously. I mean, Iran's agenda, of course, is not only influence peddling and also to weapons smuggling and trafficking. Of course, Iran has sent Hezbollah the technology that allowed it to build up an arsenal of 150,000 rockets or something. Iran also in the recent years transferred precision guidance technology or kits that enable a rocket. The rocket technology that Hezbollah had has not vastly improved since the era of the 1950s, but with the precision guidance, the rocket can find its way to sensitive infrastructure, whether it's water desalination or military base or airport, thing like that. So it's fascinating the way that Iran was able to kind of open up this highway of influence, and Hezbollah then was able to kind of drive in the opposite direction, not only into Syria to benefit the Syrian regime for the civil war, which was a brutal civil war, but also to extend its influence now in the kind of post-war era, so that its influence is not only, as you noted, in the Golan, but the Hezbollah people keep turning up in Iraq. There are Hezbollah members that have been killed fighting in Iraq. There are Hezbollah members that have been working with a whole series of Iraqi-based militias or paramilitaries, which is called the Hashd al-Shabi or Popular Mobilization Units. Those are basically, you could characterize them almost as a type of Iraqi Hezbollah. But what's interesting about Iraq's version of Hezbollah is that you don't just have one Hezbollah, you have 80 brigades of them, in the sense that you have a whole series of miniature Hezbollahs, which if you add them all up in Iraq, they start to look a lot more like what Iran calls the IRGC, or as you mentioned, the Quds Force, which is part of the IRGC. So in fact, you have a kind of miniature Iran in Iraq working with Hezbollah. And in the last few months, what's particularly fascinating is, I think Iran had at least 2 years to kind of run wild in Syria in terms of, as the Syrian regime began to defeat what was left of the Syrian rebels. And we should recall, of course, that Iran and Syria were able to do that with Russian support, and also with not only Russian support, but the tacit agreement of Turkey, because Turkey basically works with the Russians. Turkey is not against Iran. Turkey is trying to find its own way in Syria, which allows it to co-opt little pieces of Syria, as you showed in the north. Turkey, though, is not a balance against Iran, or Turkey is a piece of the puzzle. Iran basically had a free hand then, from 2017 up until, well, today. But that free hand was not allowed to use all of its fingers, because as we know from public information, Israel has carried out more than 1,000 airstrikes against several hundred targets in Syria, chopping off little pieces of this Iranian kind of octopus finger. So, and as you noted, sometimes those airstrikes have killed Hezbollah members. Either Israel has acknowledged that, in the case of the glider or the this drone issue last August, or sometimes this Hezbollah members just turn up dead. And we know that, for instance, the Iranian role in Syria is also, when we talk about numbers, it's always interesting to look at numbers, because Iran doesn't send a huge expeditionary force to Syria. This isn't the D-Day invasion. Iran only sends 1,000 members of the IRGC, maybe up to 2,000, down to 900 here and there. They don't have a huge number of operators. I mean, Syria is a relatively big country, and the number of Iranians is not so large. So Iran doesn't like to waste its own people. It doesn't like to waste its own blood. It doesn't mind wasting a bit of treasure. But from what we understand, I think, is that Iran doesn't take a lot of casualties in Syria. We also know that there is a bit of a kind of, let's say, understanding in the sense that Israel's airstrikes, the ones that Israel has admitted, have not killed huge numbers of Iranians. In fact, the overall body count, if we look at them, is in the dozens or hundreds or something, casualties, not so many. So the Iranian role in Syria is much more complex. It wants to use other people to do its fighting for it. It recruited all of these Afghan mercenaries, the Svetamiyun groups that it kind of dumped in the Euphrates River Valley between Deir ez-Zor and it's a base that they built called Imam Ali. So not only did they dump a bunch of this kind of, mercenaries there as what they call it, cannon fodder, they also the Iranians encouraged these Iraqi militias that are their allies to go into Syria to project influence. And I think in June of 2018, if we recall, the Kateb Hezbollah, which had a very nice villa outside of Abu Kumal, next to the border with Iraq, the villa was struck by an airstrike, which was then blamed back and forth a bit on the coalition, and then on Israel, and then on the coalition, then on Israel. And, of course, no one ever admitted who did it, but obviously Kateb Hezbollah lost an entire headquarters. We also know, of course, that when the United States almost came to blows with the Iranians in December of last year, the Americans carried out airstrikes in Syria targeting some of these militias, because these Iranian militias have been firing rockets at the US in Iraq. As part of that campaign, then the Americans then killed Qasem Soleimani. So it's interesting. I would say that, we had 2 years where Iran kind of ran wild. But if you look at the death of Soleimani, the fact that Hezbollah was called upon to send a senior Hezbollah official to Iraq to help the Iraqis unite the pro-Iranian factions. And you have to ask yourself, wait a sec, isn't Iraq a very powerful, large country? Doesn't it have, if it has all these 100,000 pro-Iranian militias, can't they unite themselves? Why do they need some guy from Hezbollah, which is a much smaller organization, although maybe more sophisticated, to come all the way to Iraq? I would say that, on balance then, there are serious questions about if Iran is now questioning its ability to kind of be all things to all people and do everything. Because if you're Iran and you are under sanctions and you have the oil prices cratering and you have to deal with the Americans in the Gulf. By the way, I think yesterday the Iranians blew up one of their own ships by another ship, which leads you to question, Iran is making some mistakes. I think, Iran shot down a civilian airliner. Of course, Iran has great technology. It sent a military satellite into space recently. It has new ballistic missiles. It has new drones. It has a new cyber capabilities. It seems that in the last weeks, there was a cyber attack on Israel's water infrastructure. So, of course, Iran is playing a kind of total war. But in terms of the actual, as you mentioned, the kind of Golan file, or what we're looking at in what's happening in Syria, it is not all an Iranian victory, but it is not all a victory for Israel, the United States either, because, official American policy and official Israeli policy is that Iran should basically withdraw from Syria. I think if we recall, Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu said in 2017 that Iran must not build bases in Syria. And as you noted, Israel pressured the Russians again and again and again to try to stop the Iranians from a permanent basis, because Israel's question mark in 2018 was, okay, we understand that the Iranians and Hezbollah are there. We want them to withdraw. We understand that there was a civil war. People came in. It's like the Spanish Civil War. Lots of people came in, but you want them to leave. And Israel's question was, yeah, but wait a sec, are they leaving? And obviously what we saw in the last few weeks, I have this map I was making recently, and I'm not going to show it to you, but I just describe it to you because you've seen Sarit's map. And not only are the Iranians not leaving, but if we were to look at Syrian regime media, just the media reports in the Arabic media, which blame Israel for a large number of recent attacks, including what we've seen as satellite images of many of these places. So they are certainly real attacks. We've seen just in the last weeks or months a huge number of airstrikes in Syria, including, for instance, next to Deir ez-Zor, next to Abu Kamal on the Iraqi border. We've seen numerous airstrikes next to Palmyra, next to the T4 airbase, where Iran had drones and all sorts of other munitions. We've seen airstrikes in the north next to Homs, next to an airbase there. We've seen an airstrike next to Aleppo. We've seen, as you mentioned, all of the little incidents next to the Golan. So actually, if we were just to look at the last few weeks of airstrikes, we would see an actual map of the obviously what is clearly an Iranian project, which has not disappeared. And there is a question mark in Israel, I think, between those who would like to say, like, for instance, the Defense Minister Naftali Bennett, who is leaving, that Iran has reduced its forces. That would lend us to say, well, good, see, Israel was successful. And there are those like Jim Jeffrey, the U.S. ambassador, Syria envoy, who very clearly said in the last few days, that no, Iran is not really reducing its forces. It is tactically reducing them. So, okay, you have a few different guys that went from here and they went there. Okay. But the overall strategic concept of Iran has not changed. They want to move the precision guidance. They want to have a permanent base. And that's not even discussing, of course, what's happening with the Hezbollah numbers on the ground or the Fetamiyyun Brigade or all this other groups and units, because the estimates say there is like 30,000 Iranian-controlled militias. Now, many of those militias are involved in killing or fighting Syrian rebels in the north, so they're not all there to threaten Israel. But in the type of warfare that Israel is, I assume, is concerned about, you know, the next war is not a massive land war, conventional war. It's not the First World War. The war is involved in cyber. It's involved drones, missiles. Look at the attack on Saudi Arabia last year, September 2019. That's the kind of threat I think that Iran wants to pose. And I think that Iran's, you know, ability to say, well, it will be at a time of our choosing, perhaps, is the question mark then is, you know, who is dictating the momentum to who? And I think that's kind of where we are. And I would say that that's the larger regional picture, which
Thank you very much for that, Seth. I want to ask you one more small, I'm having a dilemma between two questions, so I just asked them both. You know, I was once asked by a reporter what I don't think that the fact that Israel is trying to attack these bases, and you mentioned many attacks now, and yet the Iranians are continuing to build these bases, isn't it like trying to empty the sea with a spoon? What do you have to comment about that? And the second question is, why the Iranians are doing that? Why is it that important for the Iranians to build such an involvement in Syria?
Well, the first question you said, which is, you know, how do you actually deal with this rising tide? Is there any real way to deal with it? I mean, I think that the fascinating story, is this kind of the way in which Israel and Iran are in this weird dance in Syria, which has become, we just take it for granted now. Like, oh, there was an airstrike in Syria. It's like I had coffee this morning and there was an airstrike in Syria. So, you know,
I hear the airplanes above my head.
Right. So it's a bit strange. I mean, it's a bit unprecedented, the degree to which we have come to be used to the fact that Israel is engaged in, even publicly, a very large shadow warfare involving the best technology available to the Israel Air Force. So that's kind of fascinating, and it has not led to a war, which in the past, if there were 1,000 airstrikes, you know, that would be called a war, not just, well, there were 1,000 airstrikes. But I do think there's a question then, is Israel, you know, mowing the lawn, or is it kind of playing whack-a-mole with all these different units? I think that the evidence in the satellite images points to the fact that Israel's war is mostly against infrastructure. It's not against people. Very few people have been killed, which is a bit different than the past way that Israel used to fight wars. I mean, I remember back in, I think it was 2009 or one of those wars in Gaza, where the first Israeli airstrike, if you recall, targeted a Hamas police training academy in which at least 100 or 200 people were killed in like 5 minutes or less. So what, that's a different way of warfare. Nowadays, the idea is, no, you don't kill 100 people. You blow up the place where the weapons are, you blow up the warehouse, you destroy the telecommunications. Even sometimes it seems like the airstrike might be designed just to send a message, like, we know you're here, don't use this road. So I think that it's a very complicated type of precision warfare. It's a new type of warfare. And there is a balance, what they call a balance of terror, I guess, which is that Iran also, let's look at the Iranian attempts to strike Israel, right? The drone in February 2018, several rockets that were basically a total failure, a salvo of rockets that they knew Israel would intercept them. And then you said the attack, after the attack against the drone guys, you remember the anti-tank attack in the Golan, which was a bit of a charade. Like, they fired the anti-tank rounds and Israel pretended to evacuate bodies, and then there was nothing happened. So I don't know, it's very complicated. I don't know if it's draining the sea with a spoon. I do think that the evidence is that Iran doesn't necessarily know what its final goal is. It wants to be on the border with Israel, because if you're on the border with Israel, you can always turn up the heat whenever you want. You have a front line. And it's kind of amazing that they have a front line here. Israel's not there. Israel doesn't have forces in Iraq, although, of course, Israel has been accused by the Iraqi government of airstrikes in Iraq, but Israel is not physically there, apparently. So actually, if you're Iran, if your nomenclature and your kind of guiding principle is the liberation of Al-Quds and all this nonsense that they talk about every year, the idea of having a thumb right next to Israel's border, even if it's not some huge tank division, is a way that they can always be there to threaten, always there to turn up the heat whenever they want, to stoke the tensions. And, and they can say that they're doing something. The evidence doesn't seem to be that is an existential threat. Maybe the existential threat is the nuclear option or something. Your other question was, what was the other one? It was something about...
I think you related to it anyway. With what you just said about having the capability of traveling Israel here and there again and again from its border. So I want to take a look at the questions from our attendees. And there was one question which I wanted to ask you, whether you see any connection to what is happening with Pompeo's visit to the area. How do you see this visit, which is quite surprising during the COVID-19 crisis, that he's coming over here?
Yes, I mean, you're right. I think that it is a landmark, unprecedented in the sense that I guess his first foreign trip, right, during the pandemic. So, look, it illustrates that the American-Israel alliance system is, I guess, the best it's ever been. And this American administration, regardless of the fact that it does all sorts of things that are a bit unclear, like withdrawing from Syria and then not withdrawing and then withdrawing and not withdrawing, and it does all sorts of things that are not clear. But I think from certainly the Pompeo standpoint, which is the U.S. State Department, and obviously the military component, which is very close recent exercises between the U.S. and Israeli forces. I think there have been several recent drills that are very important. So it looks like Israel-American cooperation and coordination is probably the highest, I guess it's probably ever been in history. So I would assume that underpins it. And Pompeo is very interested in talking about, I suppose, Iran, Russia, Syria, all these different things. And, obviously when he talks to Israel, I mean, I suppose that there is, whatever's happening, he will maybe have consultations with other people in the region about this kind of larger regional paradigm or what comes next. And also, by the way, Israel has a government now, which, if you remember the American administration for about a year, the Americans kept telling the Israelis, we love you guys, but you don't have a government. What are you doing? So there was a lot of annoyance in the American administration quietly that Israel was not able to come together and have a coalition and therefore would be able to kind of have a bit of stability here. So I think that's kind of the reward a bit for Israel, which is, okay, you have a government, now we'll come.
Maybe it's all about the deal of the century.
My sense is that Pompeo is not involved in the deal of the century. My sense is, and I could be wrong, the deal of the century is run by Kushner and other people closer to Trump. and that the Pompeo file is the file that is not so much deal of century, although I do assume that you will talk about annexation and what it means for the region, like, because there is a question mark about what annexation means for Jordan and the Gulf states, etc. So I assume that there will be that discussion is, well, wait, if you do annexation, what does it mean legally, etc., etc. So yeah, he will talk about that, and that part of the deal, I assume, is something something he cares about.
There is another question which I would appreciate if you can make a comment about. Is Iran's interest in confrontation with Israel part of Iran's larger goal of becoming the leader of the Islamic world?
Well, that's interesting. I guess, you know, Iran has tried to be a leader of the Islamic world for a while, and it tried to adopt this Palestinian cause because it does certainly want to try to recruit some Sunnis to its agenda. But I think that Iran always runs up against a problem, which is that it kind of swims in a Shiite pool, and it just doesn't. I mean, that Iran doesn't have a lot of success stories, as I understand it, in Sunni areas. I do think that there is some natural collaboration that can take place actually between the Muslim Brotherhood and the IRGC. There was a meeting in 2014 in Turkey, which they talked about how to coordinate efforts against Egypt and things. But I think certainly in the last decade and a half, we've seen religion play such a big role in places like Iraq. It's very difficult for these Shiite militias in a place like Iraq with their flags, with the Ya Hussein on them. I remember being in Iraq when they were going into Mosul, and the average Sunni, whether the person was a believer or just an average regular person, was like, I don't want these flags in my town, get them out of here. So I think that, yeah, Hezbollah had a very short period of time when, if you recall, probably in 2006, when they defeated Israel in the war. I remember a lot of Palestinians with pictures of Nasrallah. And by the way, PFLP, which is a radical leftist Palestinian terrorist group, recently had a huge celebration for, Haj Qasem and his martyrdom. So, but I don't see how it can be a leader of an Islamic world in which an Islamic world is rooted in religion and tradition, much of it, and does not look to Shiism as a guiding light. So,
I agree. Yeah, I agree. Thank you for this. Want to answer one more question. There is a question here. Do you feel Israeli border communities along the Lebanese border are sufficiently prepared for potential Hezbollah incursions and drone attacks? Well, as a person who lives not far from the border, I live about 7 miles from the border, which is far away in Israeli terms, and I visit these communities every day. We're never prepared enough. Eventually, the IDF plans to evacuate the communities which are very close to the fence of the border, right next to the fence of the border, in order to make sure that the residents are secure far enough from the incursion. Yes, many preparations were made, either for evacuation, building shelters, the alert systems. All our children know where they have to be when they hear the sirens, if they're at school, if they're at home. We all have shelters at home. Every home that was built after 91 in Israel, there is a shelter. One of the rooms is a concreted room with iron door, iron window, and we know that we can hide there. But you're never prepared enough. We may see casualties in a scenario of war, in a scenario of incursion or massive artillery against Israel. There is another question. Are the attitudes toward Israel shifting among the Syrian locals living near the border from anti-Israel toward more natural and even pro-Israel attitude? These questions about popular views are the most complicated questions to answer, I believe, and sometimes it's really difficult. What I can say is that we have seen positive influence of what we call the Good Neighbor Project, when we provided assistance to the Syrians on the other side of the border, but we cannot see the fruits of this project today because these people disappeared. The wounded Syrians that were fighting in these battles actually lost in the battles, and they were either dead or expelled or re-recruited to the Syrian army, and we don't know what happened to them. So it's really, really difficult to know whether they are anti-Israel or pro-Israel. As an Israeli, I would want to believe that what we had done, and I'm very proud of this project of the Good Neighbor, and I want to believe that the assistance we provided did change some views about Israel in this area, but we cannot see the fruits in the everyday behavior of these people because they're under a lot of pressure of the Syrian government and against Hezbollah who is there. Another question, Seth, which I would appreciate if we can, relate to answer it, try to answer it together. Why is Hezbollah discussed as a separate entity? Aren't they, in effect, a unit under the control of Iran's Quds force? Do you want to say a few words about that?
Well, it's always interesting the degree to which, who takes orders from who. It does seem that, Hezbollah has had certainly a long history of many decades. And, does in the old days when Haj Qasem was alive, did he call Hassan Nasrallah and tell him what to do? I mean, I don't know. It's complicated. I think that certainly when you cut off people like Qasem Soleimani and you someone killed off Imam Munir, you must damage the way in which the consultation works, because I do think that when it comes to this kind of way in which Iran views itself as this axis of resistance, my sense is that there is a bit of consultative discussion, and it is not this isn't some like Nazi organization that runs such an oiled machine, 1 + 2 + 3 + 5. Like, it's complicated. It's rooted in communities and things. So Hezbollah grew up out of a community. It eventually took on much more of a role in Syria. It became much more mature. And as I said before, Hezbollah is now being relied upon by Iran to help rebuild networks in Iraq. So what does that tell you? Does that tell you it's a junior partner of Iran, or does it tell you that it's certainly not an equal, but it is not always clear who gives orders. I do think it's clear in Iraq that, when it comes to rockets being fired at American forces, it's very clear that this is not a franchise freelance business. Like, you don't just get up in the morning and shoot some rockets for fun. The Iranians think about it very carefully, and they also think about how many casualties to inflict, because they don't want to kill too many servicemen, because they know it will give Trump exactly what some people in the administration want, which is an excuse to go to war. So certainly they are careful, and that would lend us to believe that they would tell Hassan Nasrallah, listen, be careful. I'm sure that before he fired those anti-tank missiles after the August incident, I mean, he would have consulted directly with Iran as to what he thinks, because there is a ramification. The next step of the conflict, once there is an actual war, is that Iran is dragged in, and everyone is dragged in, and the Americans, and it can be a massive regional, calamity.
I would even add 2 points. First, Hezbollah it's an army. It's kind of a second army, or even a first army in Lebanon. But it's also a political party, and it's also a social movement in Lebanon. And both the fact that it is a political party and a social movement enable it to become such a strong military force in Lebanon. In this respect, it is different from other militias that are operating in Syria under the Iranian command. And second, I think that we can describe Hezbollah and Iran as relationship between, the president and the CEO. If you take, for example, the president of Google, the world Google, and the CEO of Google in Japan. And that way, you can understand that the CEO get the directions from the president in the home base in Tehran, but actually it also has a sense of independence in its own region in Lebanon. Moreover, Hezbollah is the most professional and most experienced, as you said, the most experienced militia or proxy in the hands of the Iranians in the region. It became a prominent player, after they managed to gain back their control in Aleppo. We've seen posters in Aleppo of Nasrallah, Assad, and Soleimani. These are the three figures that liberated Aleppo from the hands of the rebels. So, it's a little bit give us the understanding of what's going on. Okay, we have time for very short answers to the last question. Do you think that the US coalition will shift to offensive operations against the Iranian-linked SMGs? And what will that look like?
No, I would say that no. I don't think that anyone in the Pentagon or the White House necessarily to engage in a massive conflict with those groups. I do think there is a tit-for-tat attempt to deter them. Look, the American military does not have a mandate to fight them. I just spoke with, was in a meeting with, or a briefing with Pat White, the coalition commander, and webinar briefing, and they don't have a mandate to do that. So, and it's clear the Trump administration has walked back from starting some massive full-scale war after the drone was down last year. So I did understand that there was some push for a plan that if America were to consolidate its forces in Iraq, it would have the capability then to do much more because it wouldn't have as many forces. So there was a question as whether it could totally destroy Kateb Hezbollah in a campaign if Kateb Hezbollah were to provoke them and give them an excuse. And that's why I say, you know, it's a lot about two people that neither one wants a conflict. So they have to be very careful. So I don't think that it's in the US interests or the Pentagon's desire to start another conflict like in 2008 in Iraq against these groups.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you to our audience. We really appreciate it. With tens of you over here with us. If you have any more comments, questions, you're invited to just write them on our Facebook page. We will promise to take a look and answer you. If you love our work at Alma Research and Education Center, we appreciate any donation if you support us. However you like, just enter our website and press donate. And if you enjoyed this session, please share everything we do with your friends, with your social media groups. There were many more questions that dealt with the Hezbollah military capabilities. I just want to invite everybody to our next webinar during the next few weeks. This webinar will deal with 20 years to the withdrawal of Israel from Lebanon, and we'll discuss the subject of Hezbollah and the population, the Israeli and Lebanese experience under the IDF in South Lebanon, and many other questions. So thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you, Seth. Hope to see you soon in our next webinars. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.